Okay, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Barb Stewart. She is joining us from Rock Creek, where she lives and works as a consultant, planning invasive plant management and restoration of grasslands and riparian plant communities within the hot, dry ecosystems of the southern interior. Her projects include restoration work in provincial parks, public and private properties along the Kettle River. She was involved in designing seed mixes for post-fire revegetation after fires in the boundary, and regularly consults on suitable seed mixes for a variety of sites, including roadsides, utility corridors, and ecosystem restoration projects. Barb, we want to thank you for taking the time to share expertise with us. And I'll now turn off my video and microphone, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So the picture there is actually my trusty dog, Echo, who is my guard dog while out doing field work. So I'm really pleased to be speaking for CKIS here on seeding. Seeding is definitely a challenging field to be in, for sure. So I just wanted to talk a bit about some terms to start. These terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but it's definitely a different process you follow depending on whether you're doing reclamation, rehabilitation, or restoration. So reclamation, that's typically starting from nothing. So throughout my talk, I'm going to be focusing on a little bit on the reclamation, a lot on the rehabilitation, a little bit on restoration. The rehabilitation, usually you have some plants growing and you want to improve your plant community. Typically it involves seeding. Restoration usually refers to restoring a function. So seeding is often used, but often other methods. Planting trees along an oxbow dominated by grass so that the trees will provide shade and then facilitate natural establishment of more trees over time. So that's more of establishing a function. So we're actually getting nature to start repairing itself. It's important when you're considering seeding a site, whether it really needs seeding or not. We regularly disturb our plant communities, and nature actually is very good at recovering post-disturbance, but it depends on the degree of disturbance. So really, before deciding to seed, consider whether your plant community is going to recover on its own. And often, if you have not disturbed the natural soil horizons, it will return on its own, unless you're dealing with invasives. If you do plan to seed, choose your herbicide carefully if you do have invasive plants on your site, because that can really affect the success. So, often controlling the invasive plants on its own is enough to get a plant community to recover, but other times, seeding may be required. So my presentation, I want to just give a bit of an overview, talking about setting objectives and realistic objectives. I'm also going to talk about native versus non-native. Sometimes a combination is used. Are you planting forbs, grasses, shrubs? Talk about some of the limitations. So sometimes a land manager will put limitations on height or palatability or certain things you can use or not use on a site. Source of seed and the potential for contamination is very important consideration when considering seeding. You got to consider how successful your seeding will be considering your site conditions. Identify your limiting factors from growth, because that's going to influence the timing, the application methods you use, and what to expect post-seeding. How long is it going to take to recover? It takes years. So be realistic in your expectations of how long before you actually have restored your plant community. And ask yourself, are there any land management objectives or changes that need to happen to facilitate the desirable species? Maybe you want to remove livestock. So we're going to talk about all those different things, including monitoring and how to monitor and when to monitor. So I want to talk first about setting objectives, and I'm going to use the term realistic objectives. When I started out, I had high expectations for seeding of sites, and after a lot of failures, your expectations tend to get a little bit lower, and you realize that it takes a long time and often you have to reseed and do it more than once to actually gain success. So set some realistic objectives. It might be % cover the following season, or it may be 60% cover by the second season. Or you could be tracking your success based on density of species on the site. So you're actually counting plants as opposed to % cover. There's many different ways to set your objectives. Just make sure that if you're doing it in the short term, you probably want to be counting density of plants. And if you're looking at long-term 5 to 10 year objectives, you're probably looking at % cover of desirable species. Are you achieving objectives? Plan to use your adaptive management throughout the project to ensure that if things failed the first year, you don't make the same mistake the second year. So if it's not working, change your approach. Native versus non-native. Agronomic grass species, they cost a lot less and they establish better. There's no question. Native grass species are definitely slower to establish. They cost a lot more and may not be available depending on seed availability based on fires in the US. Sometimes certain species are just not available because they're being used down in the US. Native grass, shrubs, and tree species are best adapted for the site, but some are easier to propagate and more likely to survive in the long term than other species. And you want to consider genetics. Do you want seed from Montana or do you want local genetics? Consider climate change. Maybe you want both, and that's the approach we've taken here, is we're doing a combination of genetics. The land manager may have some requirements around source of seed and genetic stock as well. So you may have to source seed that has been originally from the local area, even though it may be grown in a different jurisdiction. Ask yourself if it's a grass, shrub, or tree dominated system. Grass is not suitable for all locations. We tend to focus on seeding grass, but we should also be considering seeding shrubs, seeding forbs. If we are using seed, there is no such thing as weed-free seed. Anytime you use seed, you are at risk of introducing new species. You can limit this risk by checking the seed analysis results. And if you've never actually seen a seed analysis result, just so you know, anytime you purchase seed, you can go to the local supplier. When you purchase a seed, ask for the seed analysis results, and they have to provide it to you. If the distributor doesn't have it, he will get it from the supplier. It's really important to look at these seed analysis results. It's going to tell you if there's noxious weed seeds present. It's going to tell you if there's other weed seeds, which most provincial noxious species will show up in the other weed seeds. Some of the plants that are designated invasive but are not considered noxious species may show up in the other crop seeds. And there may be examples of species that are not even designated that are on the prohibited list for BC or the proposed prohibited list that can show up under other crop seeds. And this happened a few years back where North Africa grass showed up as a seed contaminant in blue bunch wheatgrass, and it showed up under other crop seeds. That seed lot was turned back because the person was watching it, but who knows if other people purchased that bad seed lot. Also, you want to keep your seed tags in case you do find a contaminant on your site that you weren't expecting. As a general rule, I recommend using Canada #1 forage mix or equivalent. There's many different grades of seed, and it's important to limit the likelihood of noxious weeds being present in it. The grade of Canada #1 forage mix has a low probability of noxious weed seeds being present. And the reason I say the word equivalent is because often erosion mixes are not graded that high. You can only purchase them as common #2, which is a very low grade. The reason for this is because often there might be something like a cereal. There might be Jehurian wild rye. There might be spring rye in there. And those ryes are not graded any higher normally than common #2. So your mix might say common #2, but if you check the seed analysis, or if you work with your supplier, you can request that they meet the grade for Canada number 1 forage mix, and then you will know you're getting a quality mix that has a very low probability of having noxious weed seeds in it. Throughout this presentation, I'm just going to give examples of a lot of failures. So I've definitely seen some failures. I've also seen some successes, and I guess it depends on your perspective. So I want to talk about the gas pipeline they put in, the Southern Crossing they installed in 2001. And to me, it's a failure, but to the people doing the reveg at the time, it was a success. So they were able to successfully reveg this project. They used a mix of drought-resistant agronomic grasses, fairly long persistent species. In some places, they seeded by plane. In other places, they seeded using conventional tractors. And this is a picture of 20 years later on the gas line. We have a few shrubs that have come in, but for the most part, it is still dominated by intermediate wheatgrass, which is all the taller grass you see there, which the deer and the grazing animals will not eat, and then smooth brome. And there's virtually no native grass species that have come back into the site. So persistence of species you choose is a very important consideration. To me, this is a failure because natives have not returned, and it's very low forage quality in what should have been a pasture. Similar monocultures have been recorded after planting of hard fescue, smooth brome, and crested wheatgrass. Now, it depends on your ecosystem, but certainly those species you need to be very careful of using. This gas line in other locations, they actually used sheep's fescue, which can be a fairly persistent species, but at least it grew low. East of Grand Forks on the same gas line where they planted, they had the intermediate wheatgrass growing 3 to 4 feet tall as a solid monoculture. And it was actually a recreation trail as well that they had to start mowing because bikes couldn't even get through it. So the grass chosen at the time, sure, it competed with the weeds and it did a great job of doing that. But over time, it's created its own problems due to fire risk, not allowing any natives back in, and just overgrowing the trail. Here's another example of seeding. This was a cut slope on a road that was in a hot, dry grassland area. So we're in the ponderosa pine zone. And actually the seeded mix established well for the first few years, but it disappeared over time. And so this picture was taken last week. So 20 years later, we still have exposed cobble and gravel on the slope. We don't have any weeds, which is good. But what we're having, instead of grasses establishing, it's actually cottonwood, which is actually this early cereal species. So you need to look at what the drivers are in your ecosystem. And surprisingly, cottonwood, which we often think of as growing in sub-irrigated wet areas, grows really well in gravel pits and areas that have virtually no moisture. As the leaf litter starts to build up, we will start to see soil start to develop, and then we will start getting other species starting to grow, but it takes a long time. This same cut slope where the grade of the slope allowed for soil to start sloughing off the top, allowed for a little bit of the native soil to go down the slope, and now we have blue bunch wheatgrass growing. So over time, that soil will continue to slough down, and we will start getting, that's even just that tiny amount of soil that's sloughing is enough to get revegetation going on this very hot, dry slope. And that litter over time will help build more soil, and we will actually see recovery of this system, because virtually we really can't seed this at all. It's just a very difficult site to grow on. The question of to seed or not to seed. So after the Rock Creek fire, there was a lot of debate about whether or not we should be seeding post-fire or not seeding post-fire. The research out of the US was showing that 10 years post-fire, there was very little difference in the plant community on seeded and unseeded sites. So we decided to not seed the majority of the fire. The only place we decided to do any seeding was where the soil horizons were significantly disturbed by equipment. So post-harvesting, where roads were built, where harvesting was done and caused a lot of soil disturbance, those places got seeded and everything else was not seeded. In the past, a seed mix had been used on crown land that contained very long persistent species. And once seeded, the native species were not able to establish in those seeded areas. Native species perform best in a climate, in this climate here. So the eventual goal for crown land is to return to native species. But the short term, some areas do need competition to help prevent invasive plant spread. So with this in mind, post-fire, we actually came up with a series of new mixes that were low to moderate persistent species. So these are species that are going to be there for 5 to 10 years and are expected to decline on the majority of sites and allow for the natives to return. They were mainly agronomics with one native species. So we did actually go with agronomics for seeding of the areas. We made 4 different mixes, which included a dry palatable type, a dry less palatable, for livestock and wildlife, and then a wetter version of the same, a palatable and non-palatable. We realized that we needed to have not too many mixes or people were confused about what to use where. So primarily we have some hot dry mixes and some wetter zone mixes, and those are approved by the range officer. So they can be used anywhere on crown land now, and if they want to use a mix different than that, then the range officer needs to approve it. So as part of this, we did work with a supplier who then has been bringing in mixes, and they've been getting the seed analysis results, and before they even mix, now they call me to say, hey, this contaminant's in there, is that acceptable or not acceptable? And then, so all of them, we're actually getting really high quality seed going out on the landscape. So really ask yourself the question, does it need to be seeded or not? And this is just an example of, and you can actually find this online if you want it, seeding of rangelands burned by wildfire that we had come up with. We do still need to do some monitoring on the effectiveness of the seed establishment. But yeah, it's been a process in our region to change the mindset around what types of seed we are using out on the landscape. So once you've decided on type of seed, whether it's native or non-native, or whether, whether it's long persistent, short persistent types of species, you really need to consider how you're going to get that seed in the ground. Soil seed contact is so critical. The majority of seeding failures are a result of not enough soil seed contact. In order of effectiveness, the most effective is hydroseeding when you have bare ground, but don't try hydroseeding if there's a litter layer. So hydroseeding is very effective, but probably the most costly. A no-till drill, they are great. If you have rough land, but you can still get a tractor over it, a no-till drill is an excellent way to get the seed in the ground, and you will have very high success on that seeding. If the site's suitable for conventional tractor seeding, you can do that as well. And if not, then you're relying on broadcast seeding. And if your site's not too large, then raking is a really good idea. And if the site is larger, you need to either drag something over it or plant it at a time when you're likely to get incorporation into that soil. I've even tried something called seed balls. We had limited success with the seed balls, but the idea that's being used a lot overseas is you have seed and you have compost and a bit of soil in there, and you cap it in clay. So it basically gets a clay ball with the seed inside, and then you just throw it out on your site. And over time, the rain will flatten it. The seed will be there with everything it needs to grow. So this is being used a lot for reclaiming deserts. So certainly is something you can consider on really extreme, difficult sites. Again, logistically, it's very challenging to do. We didn't have the right kind of clay. We had limited success with it, but I do believe it's a very good method to get the seed, soil seed contact. Timing for seeding. Very common question, when should I seed? Some unpublished research out of Washington State University has found that the cause of most seeding failures is not enough soil seed contact. So it's really important to make sure you get that seed in the ground. The ground's going to get moist and it's going to get warm, and any seeds in there will germinate. You just need to make sure you get the seed into the soil. Immediately after disturbance is the best time based on that unpublished research. So that means your excavator has just finished building your road. The soil is very powdery and light at that point. And if you throw the seed out, it will be incorporated into that light soil. Once you've had a rainstorm, then that window is gone because that rainstorm will form a cap on the soil and the seed will just sit on top of the soil instead of going into it. So immediately after disturbance, so have the seeders follow the equipment. The next best time, this is assuming you're not zero-till drill seeding, the next best time for dormant seeding when you broadcast is before or into less than 1 inch of snow. So this would be a dormant seeding in the fall. You don't want seed to germinate in late September because it may not be mature enough to survive the winter. So if you're going to do fall seeding, you're either doing it in August, by mid-August, or you're doing that seeding in early November before the snow, or it might be October in your ecosystem, depending on where you are. You want to seed into at least or less than 1 inch of snow. If there's more than 1 inch of snow, then it's more likely to be carried off of site and not just drop down to the soil below it. Third best time is early spring dormant seeding. So there's a window typically most years where you have the snow cover and then the snow all melts. And then there's one more storm that comes in and covers the ground. So if you can capture that window between when the snow melts and that last snowfall that covers the ground, you will have very good seeding success. The advantage of this spring dormant seeding is the small mammal population is low. There's not a lot, the migratory birds are not there anymore feeding on things. So you will actually get, you won't get all your seed eaten. It will still be there to germinate. Whereas in the fall, you run the risk of all the small mammals eating it over the winter. Early spring is the last good time, depending on your ecosystem. Here in the boundary, we need our seed in before about May 10th for it to be successful. But, it depends on your ecosystem. You may have a window into end of May, early June. You just want to get that seed in the ground as soon as possible so it has an opportunity to grow before the summer drought hits. So you want to take advantage of those spring rains. Third example, hard compacted soils. So this is a site we were asked to do some planting on. It was a highway site, and when the excavator left, he compacted all the soil and made it look like this nice, neat golf green, which actually made it very difficult for things to survive. So the soil compaction was the issue. They planted it and everything died. So we were asked to come in and replant it. So to do that, there was some grass that did survive. It was kind of struggling on initially. To put the shrubs in, we actually had to use a cat bar, and we had to dig holes deep enough. We put composted manure down into the bottom of the holes to give them something to grow in because it was a very rocky site. And then we planted the shrubs and put mulch on top. So it was just so compacted that even like anything you planted there was just, they couldn't expand their roots because it was just too hard. What really needed to happen on this site was to bring back an excavator or a cat with a ripper tooth and rip up the soil and make it rough and loose, because that's what grows things. When we have equipment operators who like to have that smooth golf green and they compact everything as they leave to make it nice and smooth, it makes it very difficult for those who are doing the revegetation. Here's an example of a roadside reclamation. This was 4 years after. This was where a chunk of the highway actually was water underground that was sloughing the highway itself. So they had to address that water and redirect the drainage underground. So they had this long slope. It became a very large project. It took them months and months to remove the material. And so once they were done, the operator went and he smoothed everything else really nicely. And this is actually a fairly steep grade. And then they threw down some straw matting and some seed, and then they broadcasted to the top, and not a lot came. We had a lot of real erosion, so all the water was running off. Very little was actually being captured on the site, which is not good when you're trying to grow plants. You actually do need to have your site capture that water. The straw mesh that was put down had plastic in it. So now there's this mess of plastic and very few plants growing on that site. The site was actually broadcast seeded after, because right away they recognized that this was not going to do very well. But it didn't help a lot, because what really needs to happen on this site is, again, it needs to be changed to a rough, loose surface that's going to capture water and have some microsites for things to actually grow. Here's another example of a seeding, actually success in this case. A former railgrade, which was a contaminated site, basically, when rail ballast has a lot of nasty chemicals in there. And so once they pulled up the rail bed, it just grew a lot of invasive plants. It was just a mess of baby's breath and toadflax and horiolism, and it was a knapweed. It was just a disaster zone for weeds, because they were about the only thing that would grow on the site. We did receive some funds to address this and try to control the weeds, but we knew that if all we did was herbicide treatment, there was no native or no plant community there to recover, to provide competition for the weeds in the future. So we knew we had to reseed the site. We did, based on the species that were present, we did end up needing to use a lot of Tordon, which is one of the longer residual herbicides that can affect germination of grass, and certainly would make it so that we wouldn't be able to put forbs in. And Milestone and Clearview also have the same characteristics, where they can inhibit germination of grass within the first year. We still went ahead with planting right away post herbicide application, because we planned it actually to seed for 2 years after. So we did it twice, knowing our site was really poor condition. Now on this site, so we broadcast seeded it in the fall for 2 years in a row. We used to use a standard drought resistant mix, but we added sand drop seed, which was a really good choice to add into this. As expected, we didn't get a good seed take the first year. We planned to seed a second time, so it was done that following fall, just before snow, with the same mix, and we got a little better establishment, but it was not great. It just took some time. So sometimes on these sites, it just takes time. It took 8 years. By the time we went back to check out the site again, we now have a really good stand of sand drop seed, and that's the species you see on the left, and majority of what you see on the right also was sand drop seed. It was because it was such a rapidly drained site and such poor soil conditions, very sandy, gravelly, that the sand drop seed did the best. But we did get some crested wheatgrass growing there as well. We knew that there was no way to plant, it's not a site that you would ever get things like blue bunch wheatgrass to grow, because the soil is just not there for it. And we do have, gaps between the bunches, which is typical in the hot, dry systems where water is limiting, so plants space themselves out. Now this site, we still do have follow-up invasive plant herbicide treatments that happen, because it's the part of the Trans-Canada Trail and a linear corridor, and it's mowed. We definitely have a lot of seed spread that continues for invasive plants. So things keep showing up along the edges of the trail. So we're having to continue with that management, but at least we've established a desirable perennial plant community on that site. Something to think about when you're talking about what you want to plant on a site is think about exploiting the weakness of the invasive plant. So many species of invasive plants actually are shade intolerant. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. So if you can establish species that provide that shade, it will take care of your invasive plant problem. Along the Trans-Canada Trail in different locations, we're trying to plant shrubs. So we're changing it from grass to a shrub community, because that's going to keep the weeds down. And it is some sites that typically would have high shrub anyway. Check your nutrient levels. Do a soil test. People are so hesitant to do soil tests and find out what's going on. But if you're investing a lot in seed and restoration of a site, do a soil test and find out what your pH is, your phosphorus levels. Are you going to need to add organic matter? Certain invasive plants, do best in certain deficient soil conditions. And if you can change that, you can shift the balance from the invasive plant into the more desirable species. And think about longevity of the seed of the invasive plant. So sometimes people rush into seeding and, they just want to get out there and they just want to get that seed down. But, you really need to consider doing invasive plant treatments possibly for several years and delaying your seeding until you've dealt with the majority of that seed bank of that weedy species. To achieve success on any project, this comes down to standard best management practices. Minimize your footprint. It is so easy to dig up land, but it is so hard to get desirable things growing on that land. Most often when you dig up land, you get weeds. Make sure you salvage your topsoil on your site. Whatever project you're working on, that topsoil is just like gold. You need, the top 8 to 12 inches if your soil's that thick. That's the active growing part, and it has a lot of good seed banked in that soil. So, make sure that you strip that off. Put the top 6 inches into one pile if you're able to separate it, and then 8 to 12 inches into another pile and put it back in the same order. And be aware that any soil deeper than 12 to 18 inches isn't actually going to grow anything. We've had one project one location where they brought in topsoil and it was beautiful black topsoil and it looked awesome. They had done soil tests, everything looked good. Nothing grew for 5 years. And that's just because the soil had been harvested from too deep down in the soil horizons. So it's really important if you are doing a project that goes over multiple years that you store any soil in shallow piles if you can, because, sitting in that pile for a couple of years, a lot of that's the mycorrhizae and the microbes in the soil are lost. So it's important when you store it in shallow piles if you can, so it stays active. If you can't, if it is in thicker piles, then make sure that you mix it before you spread it out. And if you suspect it's a very big pile, you can always add bark mulch as well, because that will kickstart nutrient cycling. So you can mix that in before you put it back on. And make sure you leave your surface rough and loose. So plants don't like to grow in compacted soils. You're going to have failures with that. So leave it rough and loose, and that way we'll get the water infiltration you need. You'll get better root systems off your plants. All right, select adapted grass species that meet your end goals. So we are often planting too much grass and not enough forbs. Pollinators need food too. Fireweed, it grows well on burn sites when nothing else will. So don't waste seed on burn sites because they're not going to grow. There's a lot of wildflower species that are available now that will do very well and help your sites. I just wanted to show, this is comes from the Rangeland Seeding Manual for BC. It's a great resource. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with it or not. It's available free for download, but it does actually talk about the characteristics for the most common species used. This is the table for agronomic species, but there's also an equivalent table for native species as well that talks about drought tolerance, flood tolerance. So it's going to help you in that selection of species. And they also talk as well about, how easy they are to establish, how long it persists, how well it competes with invasive plants. So whether it's tolerant of salt. So the Rangeland Seeding Manual for BC, it should be, is a great resource for when you're selecting species for a site. And persistence is very important. I've mentioned this before. Species to avoid: smooth brome, Kentucky bluegrass, crested wheatgrass, hard fescue, sheep's fescue, and intermediate wheatgrass. And this would be a natural system. So obviously these species are okay in an agricultural system where you're grazing livestock, great. But in a natural system where you want it to go back to a native plant community over time, you need to be using lower persistent species. Use nitrogen fixing species. So we often overlook clovers, and sometimes that's because we use residual herbicides, but in other cases you should be planting clovers because they're amazing at kickstarting mineral soil and getting things growing. You may also, based on the analysis of your soil, or you may want to reduce your nitrogen levels. We definitely didn't fail to do that on one project and paid the price. We had a lot of invasive plants come up because we probably should have incorporated some sawdust or something into that soil to bind up that carbon. Most native species do well in nutrient poor soils, at least in our hot, dry grasslands, unlike our riparian areas, which do like the nutrient rich. Here is one of the example tables from the rangeland seeding manual that does have a lot of the native species, and whether they're drought tolerant or flood tolerant, so it can help you in your species selection. Native species for reclamation, there's a lot of species available these days. This is just one slide from one supplier, but there are so many species that are now available, not just grasses. There's a lot of forbs as well. So talk to seed supplier that you're using and find out what they have available. And if they don't have it, another supplier might. You can also look, if you're looking for native genetics or local genetics from local area, you might want to go to some of the local native plant nurseries instead of the commercial suppliers. So in the central Kootenay, I believe Kinseed and Nuke, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which was formerly TP Mountain Native Plants. They have seed that's locally sourced that they've been growing. So it's local genetics. So you might want to talk to them as well, because they often will have species that might be, closer to the genetic type for your region. When it comes to seed, the rate to apply, that's going to come from whoever mixes the seed. They will recommend what rate you should apply it at. And just so you know, when they're doing custom blends, usually it's based on percentage of seed count. So it's not, so they adjust for the size. And if you add a cover crop, be very cautious with use of cover crops, because in the past they used to recommend 10% cover crop, but that's way too much in most of our systems. Less than 5%, maybe down as low as 2% of a cover crop is a really good idea. What happens is your cover crop will compete with your species you're planting, especially in systems that are limited by water. Typical cost of native mixes, though, is very expensive. So you're looking between $600 to $1,000 per bag, and it might be more depending on the species that you have included in there. And so it's quite expensive versus the commercial agronomic mixes, which may be $150 a bag. So it's substantially more for natives. And if to achieve success, if your site is irrigated, make sure to deeply water your site. You want to encourage those roots to go down. That's why native plants do well in our hot, dry systems, is because they get really good root systems. And shallow watering will not promote deep root systems. The same with compacted soil. So that's why a lot of things fail, is if the compaction is there and they can't develop a proper root system, they're unlikely to survive. Monitoring. Very rarely monitoring happens. Most often we throw out the seed and walk away and hope for the best. On some sites where we're doing the restoration and the rehabilitation work, we are trying to do visual surveys, not always able to, 1, 2, and 5 years post-seeding to kind of get a sense of what's going on in that site. Then an assessment, is it sparse? Does it need more seed? Is it just need more time? If possible, do 5 years of monitoring, but that's only if you can find a funder who will commit to that. This is an example of a project where they thought they did everything right. So this is a site where it was planted with a native mix and low persistent agronomics. It was a really good mix. It was drought adapted, and it did really good for the first few months. Then, and it should have worked, but this drought in 2018, 90 days without rain, killed the drought adapted perennial grasses in some areas, but not all areas. And the issue was the topsoil wasn't thick enough. So this was a project where they put in a gas line and they salvaged the soil and then they put it back, but there wasn't enough of it. That was the problem. And there was also a compaction layer a little ways down, so the roots weren't able to get down very far. So they actually had a failure. In the end, they actually dug it up and brought in new topsoil. So as a rule, make sure if you are bringing topsoil in, it settles 1/3. So if you're recommended to have 4 to 5 inches of topsoil, you need to apply at least 6 to 8 inches of topsoil, because it's going to compact down. So in our hot, dry climates, make sure you have at least 4 to 5 inches of topsoil if you're trying to reclaim a site. Monitoring for survival. This is a site or project actually seeded last fall, and we had a few locations with very low germination. And this is because we had used a long residual herbicide last September, and then we had done a dormant seeding in November just before snow. And it inhibited germination of all species. So when the label of Clearview and Milestone says, you know, don't use on areas with a plant like 1 year before or after seeding, follow that. In other locations where we didn't have the residual herbicide, we had good germination, but most of it dried from drought. That heat wave that hit in June, because we had no rain from March till early June. We finally got some rain in early June, everything germinated, and then the heat wave hit. So we lost a lot of plants on this project from that, and it was kind of beyond our control. And that's what you need to do, is plan for that failure. But it didn't die everywhere. So some species did come. And this is a picture. This would end up being, instead of a south aspect, it was a northeast aspect. So we actually had really good germination. And then I say this is good germination, even though it doesn't cover the ground, because this is Idaho fescue, and it's going to make big bunches, and it's going to cover that ground. And in a drought system, you know, there's usually space between bunches. So if most of this grass survives, the site's going to look great in a couple of years. So that's why when I'm doing monitoring of these, I'm actually doing density counts of plants, like how many plants per square meter of which species. And because early on, you really can't do that percent cover comparison. So we know that our seed mix worked on this project. The seed mix was good because it worked here on this location. We just had a really bad spring. So the site is going to be reseeded this fall and hand raked in again. So understand your site conditions and your limitations. Plan out your project from start to finish, and, you know, plan for failure. Monitor and adapt where necessary, because sometimes things fail. And, you know, it might be small mammals, it might be deer, whatever reason, you know, you just got to anticipate those losses and monitor it, and then try to fix it or improve it or get it onto the right track. So I just want to show one example of a project that CKIS has been working on. This was up at Summit Lake. So it's an ICH type forest, typically with Doug fir, larch cedar, and hemlock trees. Understory of shrubs and mosses. So prior to planting, they removed all the invasive plants, which was a lot of burdock up there. And they actually did it using herbicides. Then they came in and they planted, and around the potted plants, they put mulch, which was really good to kind of retain that moisture. They used a seed blend that was non-invasive. It ended up being a totally native mix of blue wild rye, western fescue, Columbia brome, and slender wheatgrass. And then when you're planting in like a moisture limited system, which this is not a moisture limited system, it actually has a fairly high moisture level. But if you are planting in areas with limited moisture, you do want to plant any potted plants below the ground level so that it will funnel water down into the roots. So basically increasing your capture zone for moisture and funneling it down. And it also makes it a lot easier for watering, because you can easily put 1 to 2 gallons of water per plant really quickly when you're having people hand watering. That'll give us a nice deep watering. As you plant shrubs, for anyone who hasn't done it before, make sure that you massage those root balls, because those roots are kind of trained to go around that pot, and they will keep going around that plot even though you put them in the ground. So make sure you rip open those roots before you plant them in the ground. And here's a picture on the left. There is what has come. So they have a lot of shrubs. They're still planting more shrubs in there, but the grass mix that the seed mix they had used came in really well, and things are recovering. And of course, they're using volunteers for this. But now, unfortunately, what's happening is they're getting other invasive plants coming in on site, including St. John's wort, spotted knapweed, oxeye daisy. So they have a group that's coming back annually and will continue to hand pull these sites. So just to kind of in closing, like really ask yourself, is the native plant community going to respond on its own? This is a picture of a skid trail that post-harvest, it was just dirt. It was just bare dirt. It looked kind of compacted. You know, it was really a mess. You know, we'd be very tempted to seed it, but our policy was no, because the soil horizons weren't disturbed, we would just leave it. And this is what recovered. So it recovered really, really well on its own without any seed. So before you seed, make sure you carefully consider, do you need to? Because often the native plant communities, if the soil horizons are intact, they will recover on their own. Some resources. So, you know, plant ecologists, the local plant ecologists are a really good resource, and local agrologists. The native plant nursery staff, super helpful. They are a great resource. So, you know, definitely connect up with them if you're talking about a project and ask for their advice. And they will often recommend seed mixes, and they will figure out what species need to be on that specific site. The local native plant nurseries, they know your ecosystem, so you're going to get a more adapted mix. The commercial suppliers, they do their best, but you know, they've never actually seen your site or don't know what it looks like. So they often do very good recommendations, but you'll just get a little bit more, I think, from the local guys. The Kootenay Native Plant Society is another good resource, and the BC chapter for ecological restoration. So that group actually has a ton of information on restoration success. Mostly from, you know, well, from North America, but also from Europe. So not all of it applies here, but there definitely is some good information in there as well for the Pacific Northwest. Rangeland seeding manual, I mentioned that for a source for how to pick your species. And I don't know, a lot of people don't seem to know about that manual. Came out in 2013. It's a great resource. I also use the Shrub, Steppe, and Grassland Restoration Manual for the Columbia River Basin. It's a great book talking about all the limitations. Basically, it'll take you from start to finish on a restoration project for a grassland system. And propagation of Pacific Northwest native plants, that's another great resource that if you're going to try to propagate plants yourself, or if you want to, you know, maybe you want to be collecting shrub seed that you know, from bear poop because you just want to plant out seed, you know, that book is really good. And also the Montana Native Plants for Pollinators is good. There's a lot of other resources out there as well, and we can send these out after, but these are certainly some of the ones that I use. So now I'm going to pass it off back to Lori.
Great. Thanks, Barb, for all that information. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our funders who make webinars like this possible. So the Government of British Columbia, and as well as Columbia Basin Trust. So I do realize that you go to the next slide there, Barb, that it is time for questions. It is 12:53. Barb did agree if you guys want to stick around for an extra 10 minutes, if you have some additional questions. Now is the time to put them in the chat box. But again, this is going to be sent out via a link if you need to run, and your question can be answered later. So I do have one question here for you, Barb, from someone living in Queens Bay about the soil testing that you had mentioned in the presentation. They're just wondering the best local source of a soil test kit, or is that something that you have to send away? So how do people get their soil tested in the West Kootenays?
Actually, not that easy. To get soil tests done. Most of the labs in BC shut down. The Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors Program has been using a company, I think they're out of Ontario, for doing a lot of the soil testing. If you go to like, I don't know if you guys have like a grower supply in the Kootenays. If you do, they have to ask them and they will be able to send you to a lab. You don't necessarily want to send the soil sample yourself because it's really hard to interpret the results of it. It's best if you are a farmer, you might want to connect with the Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors Program because they will help you to get your sample off. When it comes to collecting it, it's something you can easily do yourself. Depending on your site, you would just collect samples from a cup. You'd mix up the layers, you dig holes in like 3 or 4 locations that are different, you mix it all up and then you just send it in. But it's not that easy actually finding someone to do the soil tests these days. but well worth it. They're fairly inexpensive. I think they cost around $25 per sample. So it's not very expensive to have done.
Okay, and we just had someone say in the chat box that A&L Labs is a lab out of Ontario that they recommend. So we can send that out in the resources at the end. So we did another question about the best timing for seeding. You had mentioned the fall seeding, November being the best time. So is that specifically for the boundary, or if you're in an area that's further north? So this person's asking about the Sinkmeet Marsh Sanctuary, which is on the north end of Slocan Lake. Would you follow the same result, or is it different depending on where you are in the province for seeding? Can you go a little bit earlier if you're a little bit further north?
So the reason the timing in the fall before snow is to help with that incorporation of the seed. So if you are working on the edge of a marsh where it's a small enough site that you can rake the seed in, you don't necessarily need to deal with that timing, but you want to make sure you plant your seed at a time when it's going to, if you're going to do it in the early fall, often August is a very good time to do seeding as well, that it will germinate and be mature enough to survive the winter before the ground freezes. So you don't really want to plant in the months of September, October, because often plants don't have enough time to get enough of a root system to survive that winter. So that you can do an early fall seeding. You can do the dormant seeding in the fall. That's going to help incorporate that seed into the soil, because the whole idea is that snow melts, that soil is soft, and it carries the seed into the soil. And I think that's what we really need to focus on with the timing, is get the seed in the soil. A time you want to avoid seeding is usually the month of June or late June, because what happens is if there's enough moisture, things will start to grow. If you're in a hot, dry system, drought will hit and you will lose a lot of that planting. If you're in a cooler system where maybe your daytime highs get up to 28 degrees because you're up north, you probably have a very different window for seeding. So I guess think about getting the seed into the soil. If you're not able to rake it or zero or no-till drill seed it in, then you want to catch that snow. You want that snow to help you get that seed into the ground, or you want to do it right after disturbance. If you're in a system where you have copious amounts of moisture year round, you can plant anytime. You just got to get the seed in the soil.
Okay, thank you. And someone's saying, any suggestions about cheatgrass, downy broom, question mark? I'm not really 100% sure. Maybe you know what that question means.
The question probably refers to how to deal with cheatgrass when you're seeding. Okay. So cheatgrass is an annual brome species, and in the hot, dry systems, you can have huge flushes of it and it will outcompete all the species you planted. If you know you have bromes, and it's not just cheatgrass, it's also Japanese brome, and there's two other species of annual bromes. And if you have those on your site, you should probably try to deal with the seed bank. So those bromes rely on seed, and most of that seed will germinate within the first year. So suppress seed production for at least a year before you seed. That could be bringing grazing animals in to eat off the seed in like June so that it doesn't produce very much seed, knowing that there's most of that seed germinated already, so there's no new seed being put in the seed bank. Or you could mow down the site. What you can also do is, if you get creative with herbicides, you can use the aminopyralid or picloram, so the Tordons and Clearviews. If you apply them in early September, you can inhibit germination of the bromes in the fall. So you can actually suppress it that way, but you have to wait a year to actually seed your natives in if you do that. There are pre-emergent herbicides that are available to deal with cheatgrass. On Crown land at this time, there are none listed under the pest management plan that are available and labeled for that use. But if you're dealing with private land, there are definitely pre-emergent herbicides you can put down to control that cheatgrass, and then you can get your perennial seed coming. Okay. But grazing is a great way to do it. Grazing with horses is awesome for cheatgrass control. Okay,
thanks. So we do have Lisa from Oasis she's actually just going to ask her question verbally. So Lisa, you can go ahead and ask Barb your question.
Thanks. Hi, Barb. Great talk. Question for you. You talked about when you're dealing with the native plant community, and you talked about when the soil horizons are intact, is kind of let it be and see where it goes. What about where you're dealing with an area where you've had you know, a significant cover of an invasive species like sulfur cinquefoil, and in a grassland ecosystem, and you've done fairly broad scale herbicide treatment, but you know, it's been really altered by just the nature of that monoculture of an invasive perennial plant being there. I'm just curious, in that situation where the soil horizons are definitely intact, but I think the whole soil, it's just changed significantly due to that perennial invader. So how do you decide in those situations? Is it just wait and see? I mean, my concern is you wait and see, and then it's the next invasive species that's just going to move in, or the cinquefoil over time is coming back. So how do you, have you got any situations where you've addressed that?
Oh, nothing that quite fits your ecosystem, Lisa. In a wetter zone, when we had used Tordon, so piclorum, we actually saw residual control of the cinquefoil for 7 years, which totally enabled, it was on a fairly deep soil site. And it had been like, it was just a monoculture. I didn't think there was any grass there, but we, you know, came back 4 years later and we had a beautiful bunch grass stand of fescue and June grass, like it was, and blue bunch wheatgrass. It was just an amazing response. But maybe it depends on how long the history was there, you know, as to how much the soil has changed. Yeah, I mean, that is a tough one. In my case, I would kind of wait and see what does come back. Now you have to expect that you're only going to get grasses coming back initially, and you're not going to get those forbs for at least 3 to 5 years post herbicide. So, you know, it's going to take quite a bit of time to see that change in the plant community. I honestly believe, I really wish we could use the needle grass species for seeding, the ecnathrins and the stipas, because those seem to be kind of that early cereal grass that I think help fix that soil. But they're just so hard to collect and seed. We did try to collect some, but because of those awns, we just couldn't get them to seed out. They just became massive balls. So I don't know, it's a tough one. And the reason with this presentation that I've kind of gone through the thought process is because every site is different, and there's no prescription that I can give to tell people use this for every site, because every site is so different. Did that sort of answer it, Lisa?
Yeah, and in 1 year, I'm already seeing some really nice growth of new blue bunch and other species. There might be some stipas in there, so, but they're very sparse. But maybe I'm just being impatient. So maybe we'll wait and see what happens. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd give it at least 3 years, 4 years.
Thanks.
Yeah, all this requires patience, doesn't it? We all want results immediately. So next question here for you. You didn't mention cyclone seeds hung from helicopters as a seeding method. Is the method still popular? Can you offer any insight on that?
I haven't dealt with broadcast seeding from helicopters, although it was considered on the fire. I'm sure it would be very successful if you had bare ground. You just have to watch. Don't do it on a site where you have a lot of litter, because what happens is your seed comes down and it hits the litter, but it doesn't ever hit the soil. So be careful what kind of sites. It should have very, very little litter if you're going to be using any type of aerial application of seed. And, you know, really watch your timing on that, because you could lose a lot to small mammals to coming to eat things. Oh, and something I also didn't mention is, you know, be careful with turkeys. They will destroy your seeding. Same with California quail. And I've even seen a hydroseeding site where the deer came in, ate all the hydroseed mulch, and there was a total failure of seeding. So there's all these other things that can play into it. If anyone else has experience with the cyclone seeding from helicopters, you know, maybe they can add their experience.
And someone's just wondering about seed storage and how long seeds last for storing them.
The usual recommendation is you want to use them up within, you know, 12 months of purchase if possible. So use them up that season. You can store them if you store them, you should store them in a cool, dark place that's dry. So, you know, a basement or a shop or something, keep them dry, keep them cool. They should last. So different seeds will last longer than others. And we've noticed that there's definitely a reduction in germination rates as the seed gets like 2 to 3 years old. So, you know, try to use up your seed within the first 12 months if you can. If not, you know, maybe start doing a little bit higher seeding rate. Now, there are certain seeds, certainly things like alfalfa, that might be inoculated. So they actually don't last. The inoculant actually breaks down quicker. So you want to get those in the ground a lot quicker if you have inoculants with them. And I didn't even touch on inoculants for seeding either, did I? That's okay.
No, in an hour, we're just sort of dipping our toe into this topic. We can probably be here all day. So I don't see any more questions in the chat box. If anyone will maybe leave it open for, you know, another minute here. If no one does type in, we will end the webinar, but just a reminder to everyone to please check your inbox for that follow-up email. It will probably be coming early next week with the resources and the recording, and feel free to share this information with anyone else. So I want to say a big thank you to Barb for taking the time. All your expertise is very much appreciated by this community. So thank you so much. I don't see any more questions coming in, just a ton of thank yous. So once again, we hope you guys all settle in and hunker down into an awesome fall. So thank you for joining us from CCAS, and we wish you all the best. And you all have fresh air, which is nice to have. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.